Hey everyone, and welcome to Afro Lens. So, sometime earlier this year, I finally got to watch the 2021 Candyman movie, directed by Dia Costa. And honestly, it was a pretty good movie. Not my favorite featuring the iconic slasher, but I wouldn't go as far as to say it was terrible. Cinematography wise, it hit a bunch of horror elements I love, and I do think it expanded on the Candyman lore. However, as I searched for others' opinions of the movie, some Black critics shared how the story focused more on Black suffering. Rather than it being a horror movie, it was just another Black trauma movie. I understood where these statements were coming from given the amount of on screen violence of Black bodies we've witnessed for a long time now. But still, these statements confused me a bit as I presume Candyman has always been about Black trauma. I mean, the original movies touched on gentrification and inner city crime life. The man himself was a Black man tortured and killed by a racist mob for falling in love with a white woman. And for some reason, he takes that frustration out on the Black community. So, yeah, what about DaCosta's Candyman makes it about nothing but Black suffering, apparently, compared to the originals? I wasn't sure. As I was thinking this over, it got me wondering what makes a Black horror movie just Black trauma. Doesn't the horror genre itself display characters suffering, thus traumatizing them? Well, it gave me a good video topic at least. Before we dive in though, disclaimer that as much as I would love to sit here and talk about the history of Black horror films in America, we don't got that time. However, if y'all are interested, there is a documentary out there on YouTube called Horror Noir. Got some of the best African American stars and directors, historians laying out how African American horror came about and where it stands up until Get Out. So yeah, totally watch it if you get a chance. Horror itself can be a complex genre, hence why there are so many subcategories of it. But for the most part, horror highlights humanity's fears and uneasiness. Sometimes stories will outwardly state what these fears are, but other times, the monstrosity or supernatural event acts as an allegory.
You fools! You're in danger! Can't you see? They're after you! They're after all of us! Our wives, our children, everyone! They're here already!
Unfortunately, there are also times these stories' underlying messages can fuel into bigoted fear-mongering. Whether these are conscious choices or not doesn't undermine the fact that, like with any story, you're still responsible for how you choose to depict a demographic. Depending on what group of people you are asking, each one should be able to tell you a specific fear in our community. And yeah, sometimes they are more individualistic or similar to another group's, but one thing to always keep in mind when engaging with these tales is to look into the creator's personal relation of that subject. Part of the reason we love the horror genre is that it allows audiences to indirectly consume these incomprehensible acts of violence without having to experience them, physically at least. And for some, it can give us a better understanding as to why some concepts and beings terrify others. Needless to say, some things that Black people fear are probably things non-Black people wouldn't fully grasp. That doesn't mean we can't fear a lot of the same issues, but differences in cultural and historical context will always provide different outlooks of the same subject. With that said, how exactly were Black people's fears displayed in American cinema throughout the years? Well, in the beginning, Hollywood decided they weren't so much of a concern, because to them, Black people were just not human enough, so why would we have complex human emotions such as fears? It made for a great excuse to constantly degrade us as monsters, though. Birth of a Nation, while not classified as horror, certainly was treated as one, depicting Black people as hypersexual, dumb monsters ruining the South and attacking white people left and right. Soon enough, American media started to take from African religions in order to demonize them and us by extension. Yes, most depictions of voodoo in media are racist and harmful stereotypes. They came about in popular stories around the time the US occupied Haiti. White Americans, already fearing the practice for sparking the Haitian Revolution, came up with numerous outlandish claims of what practitioners of the religion exactly do, including cannibalism and devil worshipping, that kind of stuff. They then incorporated these outlandish fibs into their stories, which eventually made its way to Hollywood. Since I'm already going there, I might as well share this. Zombies originated from West Africa. Stories of zombification traveled to Haiti and the Americas along with the enslaved Africans. Voodoo is a combination of some of these beliefs and Catholicism, so zombies were often brought up in the religion as well. Eventually, the zombie movie genre came to be as white directors used these beliefs to fuel more fear-mongering sentiments. The first zombie movie, titled White Zombie, was basically about a white guy having a voodoo practitioner turn his lover into a mindless zombie puppet. That kind of was the main purpose of voodoo in film, a way to depict white people's fears of black people having the upper hand somehow and controlling them, which, yeah, is all just self-projection. So, dang, we can't even immerse ourselves into our own cultural fears without cultural appropriation messing things up. And it's just sad so many of us don't recognize it. It doesn't help that these beliefs and religions are still associated with evil demonic magic, leading to discrimination and unjust murders of actual practitioners. And of course, we've had a lot of other bad tropes applied to black people in horror movies over the years. The magical Negro, sacrificial throwaway characters, the first ones to die, or even the help.
Ghost, I am sick of this nanny shit. I've had it. This was not in the job description. I quit!
But this doesn't mean we haven't had some cultural achievements regarding the horror genre. Even back then, black actors and creators have made tremendous strides to establish our grounds in American horror. We became the heroes, survivors, alluring villains, love interests of the alluring villains. The point is, these movies and characters started to reflect African American culture more accurately and gave us a diverse set of characterizations we didn't often see before. And while there were drawbacks along that journey, over time it got relatively better. Up until we start seeing a new type of horror genre for black people, black trauma. Remember how I talked about how fictional horror allows us to witness terrifying events without having to actually deal with them? And often allegories are used to not directly traumatize the audience? For some reason, all that consideration is thrown out the window for black people. Yeah, our dramas have to be visually literal. Movies about slavery, life in the hood, and some biopic about a black person overcoming racism or something. Yeah, a lot of these are what we describe as black trauma movies. Not really part of the horror genre, but the idea of them is pretty horrifying enough. Now, I don't think we should cut out these stories from our lives completely or anything. They have their values in retelling these true events, especially if those connected somehow were involved in the production process. They deserve to have their stories told. But at a certain point, it becomes apparent when the only type of stories our community gains recognition for are if we are visually shown to suffer for most of the movie. And that's why we call these black trauma movies. Even when they are based on real tragedies, we always seem to have to view an incredible amount of explicit violence against people that look like us, when it's not even necessary to the plot. Hell, war reenactment movies are more lenient with their graphic material. At some point, it dawned on some of us that it basically became a requirement to show black people brutalized on screen for non-black viewers. For instance, the new Jeffrey Dahmer show had white viewers brag about their inability to be fazed by the murderer's killing sprees, in which most of his victims were people of color. And even with the new Till movie, white people expressed disappointment that there wasn't so much focus on a mutilated black child's body, even though Emmett's family were heavily involved in the project. Do you see the pattern here? These movies became less about telling black people's accounts of our history, and became more about setting up this stage of violence against our community. Yes, racism and its systems are an apparent fear we have, but we already face them pretty much on a daily. We don't need a bunch of movies to remind us so vividly like this. It's just weird to see non-black audiences not only get this cathartic feeling watching graphic material of our pain, but also treating it as some distant and fictional past event that they'll never get to experience. Unless they literally steal those accounts for their own cruddy shows, then all of a sudden they remember. And that's probably why so many of these same people didn't know how to take Jordan Peele's Get Out. Yes, the movie had themes of racial discrimination in America, but unlike all these black trauma movies, this one was actually treated as a horror movie. A horror movie for black people in mind. A horror movie that revealed our fears not through senseless violence, but through the sunken place. The sunken place held so many symbolic meanings for us. The fear of losing not just one's identity, but also their autonomy is something we've always dreaded because we're aware it happens. It happened with our ancestors and it happens to this day. And yet, this is a topic some of us try our darnest to avoid. So when Peele hit us with the psychological horror, it shook us to our core. And we were able to address this topic because the main character wasn't suffering so extremely on screen for a majority of the film. In a way, I feel like the sunken place traces back to the whole zombie thing I talked about earlier. In Vodou culture, becoming a zombie was sometimes seen as a worse fate than death, because it meant that even in death, someone else could still use your body to carry out their own biddings, and you would never know eternal rest. While the movie received great praise from many, we've also seen some certain audience members become confused on how to take it. Racists were of course mad, no news there. But for those who didn't consider themselves as such, watching how black people go through life uncomfortable and expecting the worst when amongst predominantly non-black spaces was bizarre, I guess. At least with slave movies, they can conclude that they would never be so overtly bigoted, but Get Out showed a typical white liberal family can still terrify us. And you know what? They can continue being stumped about that, not our concern. So why am I even talking about Jordan Peele if I clearly don't consider his movies as black trauma? Well, Get Out had so many interesting elements to analyze. It also won a bunch of awards and was praised for a few years. Unfortunately, we have to remember that Hollywood as a business likes to leech off of whatever hype they can suck dry. Also, they just can't let go of that black trauma movie stuff. So yeah, we kind of enter this new age of what I like to call Get Out knockoffs. Basically, these are horror and sci-fi stories that touch upon racial issues in America. Nothing we haven't seen before. The issue with this batch, however, is how they kind of missed the point to what made Peele's movie unique in telling a black horror story. And that was, not showing black characters go through extreme forms of violence every minute. Antebellum was probably one of the more disappointing examples of this. I remember finding the trailer intriguing because the premise gave it off as though this was based on Octavia Butler's Kindred. I planned on watching it until I saw how every black critic compared it to 12 Years a Slave. Sucks, because looking at the premise, it is something that is plausible, and would make for a great story had it not been 2 hours worth of on-screen violence against black people. In terms of shows, there was Them and Lovecraft Country. I dropped Lovecraft once I realized there was just going to be a lot of physical and sexual violence against marginalized groups. Again, it was disappointing because it set up really good narratives, like who is considered more of a threat, the unknown's unspeakable horrors or the very real horrors that lurks around us constantly. But nah, just had to overuse on-screen violence for pure shock factor. I didn't give them a chance once my followers informed me that it was basically just as bad as Lovecraft in that regard. It's not like there hasn't been any good movies of black horror around this time. But if it didn't show black people being mutilated for majority of screen time, it was hardly remembered or advertised. Even Peele's Us did not receive the same amount of attention as Get Out, despite both movies having relatively good and thoughtful plots. But then again, Us wasn't as tied down to racial narratives as Get Out. I guess Hollywood couldn't figure out how to leech off of it then. This trend of Get Out knockoffs still continue onwards until we get to Dia DaCosta's Candyman. While Peele was the producer, he was not the director. Can't emphasize that enough. Regardless, with Peele's name in the picture, people had high expectations of this movie. And with the pushback in production due to the pandemic, people's excitement only grew. So it was surprising I didn't hear much about the movie when it finally released. Even more surprised to hear some viewers found it to piggyback off of that black trauma hype train. Like I said, the original Candyman lineup touched upon pretty jarring topics regarding the black community's history of trauma in this country. Still, one major difference between them and this newest edition is that the new protagonist is someone who has a connection with the slasher both literally and figuratively. Not only with Candyman actually, but with his home, the people, and their stories. I don't want to spoil too many things about the movie because I do think if you like the original Candyman movies, you should watch this. But I will say that stories are one of the major themes of this movie, and they stress the importance of keeping these stories alive, especially for a group of people who were forced to abandon so much of our identity and memories to begin with. Even if it is painful, you should never forget these events and cautionary tales, because even fictional stories are often grounded in some truth. Candyman has always been about keeping the story alive. While not perfect, DaCosta's interpretation of that lore seems justifiable, and kinda necessary to make sense of the slasher's motivations. So from my personal understanding, most black trauma movies are just movies showing black characters going through tremendous amounts of suffering, all while none of that contributes to the plot, if there even is one. So, no, I still can't really see 2021's Candyman as black trauma. While black horror, or any black story for that matter, will put these characters through conflict, that doesn't all of a sudden mean it's black trauma media by default. Although it's understandable when others believe that is the case. We've endured so much heartache over these past few years, but seeing all these organizations profit off of our pain somehow, yeah, that really is the hammer and the final nail. It's also frustrating when these seem to be the only stories of us allowed to be shared and viewed. We aren't always suffering. That just goes to show that we just need more variety to see ourselves in different genres. Because as much as I love some drama and horror, even I need a break. Actually, horror can be fun too. Peele's latest movie, Nope. Yeah, there were terrifying moments, but it was also a really fun movie. Anyways, I think when it comes to horror specifically, you're going to have to expect some forms of our trauma to be addressed. And depending on the writers, it can be done horribly or considerably tasteful. We should always continue having these discussions while also being mindful of who is making the story and also ask ourselves why. Well, that marks the end of another video. Glad I got this out in the month of October at least. I would have just done some top favorite black horror characters lists, but this topic has been in my mind for quite a while now, and I just needed to share some of my thoughts. Doesn't mean my thoughts are absolute, keep in mind. And if you like to share your own opinions of the matter, feel free to comment them. If you like the video, consider liking and subscribing to my channel. And if you're feeling a bit generous, consider donating to my PayPal down below. Have a safe rest of your October and, well, bye!